The fateful decision, Italy's rush to war in June 1940. The summer of 1940 presented a panorama of seismic shifts in the Second World War. By June, France teetered on the brink of catastrophic defeat, and Great Britain, standing alone, prepared for a desperate fight for national survival. For Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, this moment was not just a German triumph but a historic, fleeting opportunity to realize his long-held vision of a modern Roman Empire. The collapse of the Western Allies seemed imminent, and Mussolini, driven by a potent mix of imperial ambition, fascist ideology, and a fear of being sidelined, made a decision that would define Italy's tragic wartime experience. On June 10, 1940, Italy declared war on France and Great Britain. This was not the action of a nation prepared for a prolonged total conflict, but rather a calculated gambler, stab in the back, as Franklin D. Roosevelt labeled it, aimed at securing a place at the victor's table with minimal cost. Unlike Germany, which had spent years meticulously planning its blitzkrieg campaigns, Italy had no concrete, overarching strategy for a major European war. Its military and industrial base was woefully underdeveloped for such an undertaking. Mussolini's rationale was fundamentally opportunistic. By contributing, even symbolically, to what appeared to be Germany's inevitable victory, he could extract substantial territorial concessions. His wish list was expansive, including the seizure of the French naval fleet, the occupation of southeastern France and Corsica, and the annexation of French colonies like Tunisia and French Somaliland, thereby dramatically expanding Italy's African empire. However, the reality of Italy's belated entry into the Battle of France immediately exposed the chasm between Mussolini's ambitions and his nation's capabilities. The Italian invasion through the Western Alps, launched with much propagandistic fanfare, quickly stalled against determined French rearguard actions in formidable terrain. The Italian army, poorly equipped and lacking the motorized and aerial support that characterized German operations, made negligible progress. This military embarrassment was compounded by diplomatic reality. Adolf Hitler, looking toward the post-war landscape, desired a pliable, cooperative French regime in Vichy, not its total dismemberment by an avaricious ally. When France formally surrendered on June 22, Italy gained almost nothing of substance from its 11th-hour intervention, a humiliating outcome that frustrated Mussolini and revealed his subordinate status within the Axis partnership. Yet, Italy's declaration of war triggered immediate strategic consequences elsewhere. In London, the addition of a hostile Italy transformed the Mediterranean from a secure imperial highway into a contested battleground. British fears of invasion intensified, and the need to secure Egypt, Malta, and Gibraltar became paramount. Although initial panic led the Royal Navy to consider withdrawing forces from the Mediterranean to home waters, Prime Minister Winston Churchill forcefully cancelled the move. Britain's entire long-term strategy to turn the war into a global war of attrition, leveraging the resources of its empire, depended on holding the Mediterranean. Thus, from its very first day, Italy's war became inextricably linked to a theater of vital importance to Britain, but of only secondary interest to Germany, setting the stage for a conflict for which Rome was profoundly unprepared. First, disasters, the unraveling in North Africa and the Mediterranean, even as the guns fell silent in France. The weaknesses of the Italian war machine became glaringly apparent in its primary theater of ambition, North Africa. Here, Mussolini envisioned a grand imperial conquest, aiming to drive the British from Egypt, capture the Suez Canal, and link Italy's East African colonies with Libya, creating a vast Mare Nostrum, our sea. The British, however, refused to play a passive role. From June 11, just one day after Italy's declaration, British forces based in Egypt began aggressive cross-border raids into Italian Libya. These engagements revealed a shocking disparity. The bulk of the Italian army in Africa, commanded by Marshal Italo Balbo, was configured not for modern mechanized warfare but for colonial pacification. Its troops were largely infantry, lacking modern tanks, anti-tank weapons, adequate transport, and radios. In one early symbolic encounter, Italian units formed a 19th-century-style infantry square against British armored cars, which promptly annihilated them. In 3 months of frontier skirmishing, Italian casualties outstripped British by a ratio of over 20-1. Following Balbo's accidental death by friendly fire, command fell to Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, a veteran of brutal colonial campaigns against Senussi tribesmen, pressured relentlessly by Mussolini to invade Egypt and claim a decisive victory. Graziani was acutely aware of his army's deficiencies. He commanded over 200,000 men, vastly outnumbering the 36,000 British-led troops under General Sir Archibald Wavell. But his forces were short of trucks, tanks, artillery, and, most critically, water. After months of reluctant delay, Graziani finally advanced into Egypt on September 13, 1940, setting a modest objective just 80 kilometers inside the border at Sidi Bur. Upon reaching it, his forces halted and constructed a series of fortified camps, again applying colonial era tactics to a modern war. Graziani's grandiose proclamation, one wonders when the English will begin to understand that they have just dealt with the best fitted-out colonial army in the world, rang hollow against the static, vulnerable dispositions of his army. Meanwhile, the Maritime War opened with a dramatic British blow. On November 11th to 12th, in a daring nighttime raid, codenamed Operation Judgment, British carrier-based biplane torpedo bombers struck the Italian fleet at its main base in The raid, a masterpiece of innovation and audacity, crippled 3 Italian battleships and shifted the naval balance in the Mediterranean, granting the Royal Navy crucial operational freedom. This disaster at Taranto, coupled with the stagnant army in Egypt, signaled that Italy's parallel war was not only failing to secure glory but was actively exposing the nation's profound military vulnerabilities. The Greek gamble, miscalculation, and humiliation, frustrated by the stalemate in Africa and increasingly jealous of Hitler's unilateral actions in Eastern Europe, Mussolini sought a swift, victorious campaign to reaffirm Italian prestige and autonomy within the Axis. His gaze turned to the Balkans, specifically Greece. Since establishing a protectorate over Albania in 1939, Rome had eyed expansion into either Yugoslavia or Greece. Foreign Minister and Mussolini's son-in-law Galazzo Ciano, with vested interests in Albania, became a chief advocate for invasion, peddling wildly optimistic assessments of Greek military weakness and political disunity. He assured Mussolini that the campaign would be a brief military walk. This view was opposed by more cautious figures, including King Victor Emmanuel III and Chief of Staff Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who warned that the Greeks were tough, motivated fighters. Crucially, Germany also opposed the action. Hitler needed Balkan stability to secure vital raw materials, particularly Romanian oil, and feared an Italian adventure would provoke British intervention in Greece, threatening his southern flank. Mussolini, however, perceived Hitler's movement of Luftwaffe units into Romania in October 1940 as a slight and a fait accompli that demanded a forceful Italian response to re-establish the equilibrium. In a fateful decision, driven by pique and imperial vanity, he ordered the invasion to proceed, deliberately keeping Berlin in the dark. Planning was rushed and catastrophically flawed. The Italian army, partially demobilized for the harvest, was unprepared for a winter mountain campaign. Logistics were a nightmare, with the single-usable Albanian port of Dors clogged with marble for fascist monuments instead of military supplies. On October 28, Mussolini presented Greek dictator Ioannis Metaxas with an impossible ultimatum, which was famously refused. The invasion began with Italian forces attacking in 3 columns into the rugged, mountainous Epirus region. They expected to face 30,000 Greeks. In reality, over 300,000 were mobilized. The Greeks, forewarned and fighting on defensive terrain, offered fierce resistance. Initial Italian advances soon bogged down in autumn rains and tenacious Greek counterattacks. The elite Julia Alpine Division, advancing in the central Pindus Mountains, was isolated and mauled. By mid-November, the Greek army had not only halted the invasion, but had launched a powerful counteroffensive, pushing into southern Albania. Mussolini's war of prestige had backfired spectacularly, triggering a full-scale military crisis that threatened to collapse the entire Italian position in the Balkans. A furious Hitler was forced to contemplate a German intervention to rescue his faltering ally, fundamentally altering the strategic scope of the war. Operation Compass. The North African collapse. As the Italian army reeled in Albania, Britain seized the opportunity to deliver a knockout blow in North Africa. Reinforced with fresh Commonwealth troops and modern equipment like the heavily armored Matilda to tank virtually invulnerable to Italian anti-tank guns, the Western Desert Force under Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor prepared a limited counterattack. This operation, codenamed Compass, quickly evolved into a decisive rout. On December 9, 1940, British and Indian troops stormed the fortified camp at Nibawa, achieving complete surprise. Matilda tanks crushed Italian light tanks and overran positions, with one Italian doctor describing the scene as the nearest thing to hell I ever saw. The pattern repeated over the following days at the camps of Tumor and Sidi. Italian soldiers, often brave but woefully under-equipped, fought with grenades and small arms against an integrated British force supported by tanks, artillery, and naval gunfire. Their static, colonial-style camps became death traps, easily isolated and destroyed. British mechanized columns, exploiting the desert flank, raced ahead to cut off retreats. Italian morale, strained by poor leadership and the shock of the armored assaults, collapsed in many units. In just 3 days, O'Connor's force captured nearly 40,000 Italian prisoners, hundreds of guns, and scores of tanks, at minimal cost. The British then continued the pursuit, investing the fortress port of Bardia, which fell in early January 1941, followed by the vital port of Tobruk. The offensive culminated in February 1941 at Beta, where a small British blocking force intercepted and destroyed the retreating Italian 10th Army. In a campaign of just 2 months, a British-led force of never more than 2 divisions virtually annihilated an Italian army of 10 divisions. advancing over 500 miles and capturing 130,000 prisoners. This was not merely a defeat, it was a catastrophic military disaster that erased Italy's African empire in Libya and left its remaining forces isolated in East Africa. The disaster forced Mussolini into the ultimate humiliation, having to openly request German military assistance to prevent total collapse. Operation Compass laid bare the consequences of entering a modern war with an army designed for a previous era, unprepared in doctrine, logistics, and technology for the battlefield of 1940. Diagnosing the disaster, Italian weakness or Axis failure. By the end of 1940, Italy's twin military disasters in Greece and North Africa demanded serious explanation. Traditional Anglo-American historiography has long attributed these failures primarily to Italy's internal weaknesses. According to this view, the Italian armed forces were undermined by poorly trained and poorly motivated conscript soldiers drawn largely from a rural peasant society, combined with a chronic shortage of modern military equipment. Much of Italy's army still relied on outdated World War I-era weapons, while its fascist command culture often promoted political loyalty over professional competence. Above all, Benito Mussolini's impulsive leadership is blamed for dragging Italy into war in pursuit of imperial prestige without adequate preparation. Statistical evidence appears to reinforce this interpretation. Italy produced only about 2.7% of global industrial output, far behind Britain's 9.2% and Germany's 10.7%, and only a small proportion of Italian divisions were fully combat-ready in mid-1940. Severe shortages of tanks, anti-tank weapons, radios, and automatic firearms severely limited Italian operational and tactical effectiveness on the battlefield. Yet, a more nuanced interpretation, advanced by revisionist historians such as James J. Divert, suggests that these internal shortcomings alone cannot fully explain the scale of Italy's defeat. This perspective shifts attention toward the dysfunctional nature of the Axis alliance, and, in particular, Germany's role in shaping the strategic environment in which Italy fought. From this angle, Mussolini appears not as an equal and eager partner in the Pact of Steel, but as an anxious and reactive leader, attempting first to restrain Hitler, and later to compensate for his earlier hesitation by launching ill-timed campaigns. Italy's concept of a guerra paralela, parallel war, aimed at carving out a Mediterranean empire was fundamentally flawed, not simply because of Italian military weakness, but because it placed Italy directly against Britain, a global power fighting a total war for national survival in precisely that region. Compounding this problem was the lack of genuine Axis coordination. Germany, preoccupied with its long-term plans for a war against the Soviet Union, regarded the Mediterranean as a secondary theater and offered Italy little meaningful strategic guidance or material assistance. Mussolini launched his offensives under the false assumption that Britain was nearing collapse. Following German victories in Western Europe, crucially, he was unaware that Hitler had postponed any invasion of Britain and was instead turning his attention eastward. As a result, Italy found itself fighting a far broader and more demanding war than anticipated, against an enemy that remained undefeated and capable of concentrating superior naval, air, and mechanized forces in the Mediterranean. From this revisionist standpoint, Italy's defeats appear less as the inevitable consequence of national incompetence and more as the product of catastrophic miscommunication within the Axis, German strategic self-interest, and a fundamental misreading of the wider war. Even phenomena such as the mass surrenders of Italian troops in North Africa are reinterpreted. Rather than reflecting cowardice or collapse of morale, they are seen as the predictable outcome of static, poorly motorized infantry formations, being encircled, outmaneuvered, and isolated by a fully mechanized opponent, fate that might have befallen any army fighting under similar conditions. The German rescue and the end of the parallel war. The disasters of 1940 forced a painful and definitive end to Mussolini's dream of an independent, parallel war. By December, with his armies in full retreat in both Albania and Libya, the Italian dictator had no choice but to swallow his pride and appeal to Berlin for direct military intervention. Hitler, though furious at Mussolini's reckless adventurism, which had destabilized the Balkans and exposed the Axis' southern flank, recognized the strategic necessity of preventing a total Italian collapse. British forces in Greece could threaten the Romanian oil fields, and a British conquest of Libya would imperil the entire Mediterranean. German assistance, however, came with strings attached and a clear air of resentment. As one Wehrmacht officer cynically noted, the support was unwillingly given and unwillingly accepted. In early 1941, the mechanism of rescue swung into action. Hitler issued Directive No. 20, ordering preparations for Operation Merida, the invasion of Greece, to secure the Balkan flank. More immediately for North Africa, he authorized the deployment of a small but potent mechanized force, the Deutsches Afrikakorps, under the command of the then-unknown General Erwin Rommel. Rommel's arrival in February 1941 marked a pivotal turning point, with characteristic audacity in exploiting British forces weakened by the diversion of troops to Greece. He launched a counteroffensive in April that drove the British back to the Egyptian border, though failing to retake Tobruk. While this stabilized the front, it effectively subsumed the Italian war effort under German direction. Italian units were now auxiliaries to German panzer divisions, their operations planned and led by German commanders. The Guerra Parallela was over. Italy had become a junior partner in a German-dominated war of attrition, across a theater it could no longer control. The campaigns of 1940 had proven disastrous, not just in their immediate military outcomes, but in their political consequence. They stripped Italy of its strategic autonomy, making it dependent on the very ally whose successes had spurred Mussolini's fatal overconfidence. The road from the opportunistic declaration of war in June 1940 led inexorably to this subordination, setting the stage for the eventual, even greater catastrophe of the Italian state's collapse and the brutal civil war that followed Mussolini's fall from power in 1943.